Welcome to the Solid Signal Podcast, and the week is February 27th, 2023. I try to stay mostly on topic on this podcast, but then occasionally I drift off, and I find actually that the off-topic stuff is the stuff that people listen to more than the on-topic stuff, so I don't really mind doing a little bit of off-topic here or there. And it gives me the opportunity to kind of clear my mind a little bit of some things that keep me up in the middle of the night. Anyway, so this past weekend, I happened to get caught up on some of the Oscar-nominated films out there, and I like to do that because I am genuinely a film buff, and I've seen a lot of films, and it gives me an opportunity to really know whether or not I think the Oscar folks get it right or wrong. So this weekend, I decided to see Babylon and the Banshees of Inisherin. First, I'll talk about the Banshees. Now, I really did not want to see this film because it was my opinion, with absolutely nothing to back it up, that this was the sort of self-important Oscar nonsense that is going to win bunches of awards and people are going to forget about it almost immediately after that. I think that I expected a film where people stare meaningfully in the distance while they're looking at rocky cliffs and say things that you're supposed to think are pithy and funny at the same time, and that's about all you get. My review on that was surprisingly straight on. That was you do get a lot of exactly that, and it's kind of funny because that's exactly what I was expecting. But also there's some wry humor in it. There's some good stuff, and I think the performances were good. And there was stuff I was not expecting. I don't want to spoil it for you. The other film that I saw over the weekend, as I said, was Babylon. Now, Babylon is an overwrought mess of a movie, clocking it at over 3 hours, that takes the audience on a trip so convoluted that it's almost mind-numbing. It manages to make Margot Robbie look ugly almost consistently. There are very few cases where she doesn't, and that in itself should be pretty hard to do. It combines some staggering, truly amazing visuals that I really don't want to spoil for you. Suffice it to say that you will see things that you probably haven't seen before. But overall, at over 3 hours, this was a film that just pounded the same stuff into your head over and over again. This film could have easily been an hour and a half of a really tight edited film and would have been just as good. Probably would have been better because by the time I was done watching it, I was just exhausted. Babylon, and I'll get deeper into Banshees in a minute, by the way. Babylon was a film that was way too literal in what it said and what it did. The very first scene involves pushing an elephant up a hill to satisfy Hollywood studio executives. And it turns out the only way that you can get the elephant up that hill is to get him to, shall we say, lighten his load from a digestive point of view. I'm skirting around certain words I don't want to say here in this blog. It's a family-friendly podcast and blog. And so that in itself is just the obvious metaphor for Hollywood, right? Altogether, which is, you cannot do anything, especially if it's something that sounds ridiculous to do, unless you are willing to be defecated on. The film goes on to be extremely literal for well over 3 hours. At one point, going into the literal depths of depravity. I don't want to spoil it, like I said, if you do want to see it. There's another shot where Margot Robbie literally disappears into the dark. She fades to black personally. And the film is just full of these literal references. It's like metaphors gone wild. And it ends up being something where they're just hitting you over the head, just in case you didn't figure out what he was trying to say. He's going to say it over and over and over again. On the other hand, the Banshees of Inisherin, for all that it was, and was kind of that kind of arty kind of movie. Yes, there were some repetitive parts. Yes, there were some parts that that they did try to hammer home over and over again. But in its taut under 2 hour running time, felt way too short. It's not that I really wanted to spend more time in that world. It's more that, well, it would have hit a little bit better. A lot of the jokes would have hit a little bit better if I'd had some time in between. And this is the bottom line of this week's podcast, which is that movies are, ironically, way too long and way too short right now. We're in a point of popular culture where the traditional 2 to 3 hour running time of a movie is just not satisfying anybody. Babylon was way too long, and there's no getting around that. It was just a mess. It was overindulgent, is what I will call it, overindulgent, because it was very clear that filmmaker Damien Chazelle did not want to leave anything on the table when it came to editing. He just wanted to show you every little bit of everything so that you would get an idea of how tedious movie making was. And you were supposed to feel, I think, tedious about the film, which is not really a great way to feel about a film. And on the other hand, The Banshees of Inisherin would have been a much better 8 episode TV series, because then some of the running gags, some of the jokes could have been spread out over the course of 2 months of watching, and you would have probably gotten a better feeling for that kind of life that they were living in this film, and at the same time would have given you some opportunity to explore the backstory about that area, about those characters. Over the course of a limited series, we would have gotten a much better idea of the kind of pace of these people's lives, and also it would have been a lot clearer going in exactly when it took place. No spoilers, this film takes place in the mid-1920s, which is ironically almost the same time that Babylon takes place, so the two films are totally, totally different. But it doesn't say that. I'm not saying that it really needed a title card that said in the 1920s or something like that, but I spent the first 20 minutes of the film wondering why nobody had electricity or phones or, anything of that nature. And eventually I kind of did a little bit of, Wikipedia bombing and stuff like that, and I found out that the film was, that it did take place in the 1920s, and they could have put it in cultural context if they'd had a bit more time. Also, if they had a bit more time and a bit more budget, they could have probably spent a little bit more money on special effects. I don't want to spoil it, but there are a couple of special effects that are really key to the film, and let's be honest, that just weren't done terribly well, and they take you out of the film a little bit. I really tend to be very critical, very picky about movies and the movie making process and what makes a good movie, because I've seen just so many of them. And I've seen really good movies, and I've seen overwhelmingly many bad movies. And I remember it was a long time ago when I was a young person that the great Roger Ebert had said that when you see so many films that are subpar and they remind you of how other films are so much better, it makes you bitter, and it makes you not want to see more films. It just makes you want to fall back and enjoy the films that you already know are good. And that it's a challenge every day to try to go out and open your heart to new movies. Now, these two films specifically made my heart feel a little bit more closed. I'll give it to the Banshees for clever writing and some peppy dialogue and some humor that I just wasn't expecting. But all in all, it's not a film for the ages. It's just a film that you're going to consume once and go, and then move on. As soon as it ends up at the end of awards season, it will probably make a tour of the free streaming services and then be largely forgotten, along with other winners like Sling Blade and The Piano and Dancing at Lunasa. If these films even ring a bell for you at this point, I'd be surprised. But in their day, each one of them was heralded as the most amazing achievement in film of all time. The Banshees will probably join that. And it's my hope that Babylon and its general failure in the marketplace makes a guy like Damien Chazelle think twice and makes the industry in general think twice, because I think the movie making industry loves movies about itself and oftentimes will unfairly reward movies about the movie making industry. Here's another one that you probably have forgotten about, a movie called The Artist, which was a silent film made only about a decade and a half ago, maybe a little bit less, that most people have forgotten about. It was around the same point in time and made a lot of the same points that Babylon tries to make. It just was a shorter film and much more charismatic. Damien Chazelle got a lot of criticism of his movie La La Land for cultural appropriation, for painting a really sunny picture of life in Los Angeles, for all the things that, gave everybody that, this kind of warm, fuzzy feeling and that had nothing to do with reality. And so he almost overcorrected with this film, going out of his way to avoid cultural appropriation when at all possible, and talking about just how utterly depressing the movie making industry is. Without spoiling it, I can tell you that the moral of the story is that honestly, you can't make a good movie, according to Damien Chazelle, until somebody literally dies. I'm not quite sure that that's true, and I'm not sure that I needed to have that point hammered home no less than 5 separate times during the course of that film. If Babylon had been better edited, I would have enjoyed it. If Banshees of Inisherin had a lot more content spread out over 8 hours instead of just under 2, I would have enjoyed it. And this brings to mind that when you look at movie making, there are a lot of important roles that are played here. The director has a role, the actor has a role, but more and more, you don't think about how important the editor's role is. The role of the film editor is so critical, and oftentimes the film editor gets no credit, and they spend months in a crowded room listening to the director tell them how to do their jobs. And in the end, if they're lucky, they can salvage a film that is really just marginal and turn it into something great. Or in the case of the films of Martin Scorsese and the films of Francis Ford Coppola, both of which are supremely edited, they can take a film that is good to begin with and just project it into the stratosphere. It is the editor who really takes the extra step with cinema and takes things to a level that was never really intended, I think, from the beginning. There is another film I wanted to tell you that has to do with editing. This film is called Zeroville, and honestly, even though it came out in 2019, I had never heard of it until I happened upon it about 6 months ago. I'm not going to pretend it's the best film in the world, because it isn't. It's really a film that has a lot of potential, but then it treads ground that is far too familiar, ground that was tread by people like Quentin Tarantino a lot better. But what it does is discuss the almost the religion of editing, and how editing takes the raw footage that filmmakers provide and turns it into something that is really magical. The film is not without its flaws. It is almost completely flaws, in fact, and there are parts of it that are practically unwatchable. But still, I recommend it just as much as I'd recommend either of these other 2 films. If you happen to find it out there, it is worth a watch, and probably a little bit more deserving of your attention than either of the films that I'm talking about today. Anyway, I'm beginning to sense that I personally am starting to repeat myself. And since I don't want to go back and edit this podcast, even though I probably should, I'm going to stop for now. Thank you for your time and for your indulgence. This has been a very long podcast, and So please leave a like and subscribe and a comment if you think this is the kind of content that you would like to hear on this podcast. Otherwise, I'll go back to talking about the regular stuff and trying to keep it under 10 minutes. That's all for today. Have a great week.